Welcome to session 7 in our series on the prophets, and today we're finishing Jeremiah and also looking at Lamentations. Prophets typically claim that the word of the Lord came to me, and that's a phrase that Jeremiah uses frequently in his book. Prophets often engage in symbolic activities, and we see that happening in a number of instances in Jeremiah. Woe to you is particularly a phrase that Jeremiah uses to introduce his oracles. You can see there the list that I found from my concordance trawling. And adherence to the covenant of the Lord lies at the root of all that the prophets say. And we find this especially in Jeremiah in chapter 11, and then in a passage we'll look at later in this study, chapter 31, a very well-known passage from Jeremiah. As always, we have in mind the issues of forth-telling, speaking into the present situation, as Jeremiah warns about the invasion and the exile, and in fact looks forward to a return from exile. So we hold in balance forth-telling with foretelling, looking into the future, looking into the immediate future, looking into the 70 years and far beyond that. And again, we find in the prophets this constant grappling with the questions of the justice of God and the mercy of God, the prophet articulating words of judgment and punishment, and yet also offering God's compassion and hope to the people for the future. A reminder that Jeremiah lived at a crucial turning point in the history of Israel, because Babylon had conquered Assyria, which was the dominant power and the power that took the northern kingdom a century before. So Babylon was now the dominant empire in the region. And 20 years after taking over the Assyrian region, the southern kingdom fell to the Babylonians. That's outlined in 2 Kings 24 and 25. And the narrator there says that Judah went into exile out of its land. Jeremiah himself was sent into exile, but he didn't go to Babylon. He went in the other direction to Egypt, and he maintained contact with the exiles in Babylon, writing them a letter. That's the other passage from Jeremiah that we're looking at this morning. Centuries later, Tertullian makes the claim that the other Judahites who were in exile in Egypt with Jeremiah were so exasperated by him that they stoned him to death, and that would have been around the year 570. There's no record of that in any biblical texts. That's just Tertullian many centuries later making that claim. And he's doing that in the context of the Hebrew passage in the lectionary, which talks about prophets being stoned and sawn in half and all kinds of exotic things like that. So Jeremiah is in exile in Egypt, to the bottom left of that map. But most of the exiles have been taken on that route that's marked in red, up into Aram, and then across to the Euphrates River, and then tracing that all the way down to Babylon, in Babylonia. And we know that Jews were in exile in Babylon for around about 60, 70 years before they were allowed to return to Judah, but that's jumping ahead to a future prophet. And indeed, many stayed in Babylon beyond that and chose not to return to Judah. And so what Jeremiah does is actually quite crucial in enabling those people who, of course, had grown up in Babylon, to stay there beyond the time when they could return to Judah. What he does in his prophecies is quite crucial to that kind of development. He had told the people of Judah in chapter 27 to bring your necks under the yoke of the king of Babylon and serve him and his people and live. So he was being to a degree, pragmatic in what he was saying to the Judahites in exile. Rather than seeing the foreign power as an enemy, he exhorts the people to submit to the Babylonians. He says this will be a hard arrangement, but other oracles make it clear that this will not be a permanent arrangement. And this is a change in theology. God has been seen as the God of the land, the God of the people in the land, the God who vigorously prosecutes the case of the people of Israel and Judah. So very nationalistic God, and very much for the Judahites, the southerners, linked to the temple and the Holy of Holies in the temple. That's where God resided, and from there God exercised dominion over the nations. But Jeremiah writes to the exiles in Babylon, saying to them, submit to the powers. And he actually begins the process of seeing that that foreign power could well be an agent of God. And we'll see when we get to Deutero-Isaiah in a few weeks' time, that this becomes a crucial development in theological understanding. So we want to look in our first breakout room at the letter that Jeremiah, from his exile in Egypt, sends from Jerusalem to the remaining elders among the exiles, and to the priests, the prophets, and all the people who Nebuchadnezzar had taken into exile from Jerusalem to Babylon. And in that letter, Jeremiah exhorts the people to build houses, to live in them, to plant gardens, to eat what they produce, to marry the locals, take wives and sons, give your daughters in marriage, that they may bear sons and daughters, multiply there, do not decrease, to ensure the continuation of the people, even though they are in exile and not in the beloved Holy Land. And then these really important words: seek the welfare of the city where I have sent you into exile, and pray to the Lord on its behalf, for in its welfare you will find your welfare. And this is a really important, in my mind, and in the mind of many commentators that I've read, it's a really important statement about the posture of the people in exile. Life goes on in exile, and God has not, in fact, abandoned them, but God has sent them into exile as a punishment for the sins of the past. And so God will continue to guide them, and they need to pray for the welfare of the city in which they live. So there's very positive commandments, in a sense, that he gives to the exiles. And I want to invite you to ponder, how might the words of Jeremiah inform two things that we do as a church? How might it inform the pastoral care that we offer to other people in their times of difficulty? We've all been through times of difficulty ourselves, and so we might be able to put ourselves into the position of the exiles. How does what Jeremiah is saying to them help us think about how we offer pastoral care to people in difficult situations? And also, as a church, wherever we are, how do these words help us to think about what our mission is to the community in which we are placed as church? So they're the two questions about pastoral care or about mission. You may choose in your group to do one or the other.
In group 2, we had a long discussion of intermarriage. We thought you said Jeremiah's advice was to intermarry with the Babylonians,
yes,
and the Assyrians, but as we read it, it doesn't say that at all. It just says marry your sons and daughters and multiply. Could you explain this point?
Okay, yeah, well, the text just says marry, take wives, and give your daughters as wives. But we know that the reality is that that they did marry Babylonians and were integrated into that society. Yeah.
They probably got into all sorts of trouble when they got back to
That's right.
to
Yeah,
Israel, because either Ezra or Nehemiah told them to get rid of their
that's right.
foreign
Yes.
wives or husbands.
So those that had returned to Israel with foreign wives were told to send their wives away. Yeah. So that indicates that they were marrying out.
Am I right in thinking that the cause of the gulf between the Samaritans and the Israelites of Jesus's time was that the Samaritans were descended from those who had interbred with other peoples?
So the Assyrians, 2 Kings 17 tells us that the Assyrians took away basically the elite class of the northern kingdom, and they brought people from Kuthar and a whole lot of other places and installed them, and including bringing the priests of their foreign deities. And the Samaritans descended from that group, from that intermarrying of the local northerners, the local northern Israelites with the introduced foreigners.
Could the Samaritans then not plead, look, our ancestors were simply obeying the prophet Jeremiah, putting into practice his teaching?
Yes. Well, the Samaritans, of course, argued that they held correctly to the correct interpretation of the Torah, that they were the faithful descendant, that faithful followers of the law of Moses, and the way that they understood things was right, and that the Southerners had gone astray. It's a bit like what we see going on in the Anglican Church these days about who's got it right and who's got it wrong.
Yeah.
It's a perpetual religious tension. Yes. Yeah. So that's my take on what Jeremiah is saying, but I think it's borne out, as Piers has indicated, by what we see happening later when they return. And certainly to go forward many centuries, like about 10 centuries or 12 centuries, there are two versions of the Jewish Talmud. One is called the Jerusalem Talmud because it comes from scribes around Jerusalem, but the other is called the Babylonian Talmud. And so there was a Jewish community still in Babylon in the 500s, 600s, 700s of the Common Era and on through into into Middle Ages. And they had their own rabbis, their own Torah teachings, their own Talmud. It was similar to the Jerusalem Talmud, but it was much bigger, so it had a lot more sayings in it. And so that indicates that the Jewish community stayed on. And the other indication, I think, of the interrelating, not necessarily intermarriage, but the interrelating is Aramaic. Aramaic came back from the Babylonian exile, and Aramaic is a blending of Hebrew, in my understanding. I've never studied it, but what I've read about it, it's a blending of Hebrew and the language of Babylon at the time, so that it's a kind of modified Hebraic language. And that, of course, became the common language of the people at the time, by the time of Jesus. Now, that had come back from the Babylonian exile and had continued on. So that's one sign of the intercultural mixing that's happening. And once you start putting cultures together, all sorts of things get, we see this in our own society. All sorts of things get mixed up, All right, so in your groups, maybe just one comment about pastoral care and one comment about mission. Did anybody talk about pastoral care? Any thoughts on that?
We did, and we said that we should always make sure we offer hope to people.
Yeah.
Regardless, it doesn't matter what people are going through. We need to ensure that they understand that whether they like it or not, there is light at the end of the tunnel. It may not be the light that they wanted, but it will definitely be a light they can hang on to.
Yeah, right. Yeah, that's a great comment. Thanks, Patricia's group. Now, did anyone think about mission?
I don't think, did we get that far?
Okay. I have a whole sermon on this passage, which will probably end up on my blog when we get to Jeremiah 29 in the lectionary, about how it can inform our mission. So we'll leave it hanging for that.
We talked a little bit about heading overseas, like, for instance, going to Ukraine at the moment.
Yes.
And what hope are we offering there? And acknowledge that Jeremiah had the benefit of the word of the Lord that said everything's going to be okay.
Right. Yes.
Mm.
Yes. Yes. So it's interesting, isn't it, that Jeremiah's remembered as the weeping prophet and as a doomsayer, and yet, in fact, he's the one that starts to turn the things around. Even in the midst of being taken into exile, he can see beyond that. He can see some hope. And that kind of leads us to our the next segment, which is that we're thinking about his words in chapter 31 about the new covenant. In chapter 30, he says, "The days are surely coming, says the Lord, when I will restore the fortunes of my people. I will bring them back to the land that I gave to their ancestors. They shall take possession of it." And we know, in fact, in chapter 32, Jeremiah buys, even though he's in exile, he negotiates to buy a field in his hometown of Anathoth from his cousin, as a symbol of confidence that the people would return and that his family would be able to use that field. And in the midst of these chapters, these chapters of hope, we get his words about the new covenant that God says he will make with Israel. I will put my law within them. I will write it in their hearts, on their hearts, and I will be their God, and they shall be my people. That's a standard covenant terminology phrase, of course, that we see in Scripture, not just in the prophets. I want to think about these words in two contexts. One is in the original forth-telling context, and the other context is as foretelling and the way in which Christians have understood these words. So think first about forthtelling. What does it mean for Jeremiah to say that God is going to give a new covenant? So in the narrative sections of Scripture, there's a series of covenants, or it might actually be the same covenant that is made and remade and renewed. There's the covenant with Noah in Genesis 9, and not just with Noah and his family, but with every living creature, a really important ecological statement in chapter 9 of Genesis. There's the covenant with Abraham, the father of the nation, Genesis 15. There's the covenant that really is the central covenant for the Jews going right through the centuries, because the covenant with Moses on Mount Sinai is where the law was given, the 10 words, and then the whole series of other laws. And this covenant was sealed in a ceremony by the blood of the covenant, the sprinkling of the blood of the sacrificed animal. So that gives us the blood of the covenant language that we are used to in our communion service. There's the incident of the golden bull where the covenant was broken and had to be remade, and God reissued the laws. There's a story in Joshua when they get to Gilgal, as the people enter Canaan, the first thing they do when they enter Canaan is to renew the covenant. They have a covenant renewal ceremony. And in fact, as we saw a week or two ago, last week, Josiah, after the discovery of the book of the law and his consultation with the prophet Huldah, he actually reinstitutes the law and has a renewal of the covenant. And then after Jeremiah, when the people return to the land in the days when Nehemiah is the governor, Ezra reads from the book of the law for a full day. All the people were standing beside the water gate, the book says, and Ezra and his henchmen read from the book of the law and interpreted it to the people, and that renewed the covenant, and then worship was reinstituted. So we actually have a whole series of either covenants, plural, or the central covenant, which is retrojected to Noah and Abraham and then carried on and renewed. through Joshua and Josiah and Nehemiah. And so my question relates to, does the words that Jeremiah speaks then about a new covenant, what does that mean for the people of Israel? Would they have seen this as a brand new, completely new thing? Or would they have seen this in the light of their stories from of old as a renewing of the old covenant, a renewed covenant rather than a brand new covenant? So that's the forthtelling question. How did the people of Israel, do you think, see this? And for us as Christians, how should we understand the words of Jeremiah? Because they are picked up in the New Testament, as your resource notes indicate, at a number of places by a number of writers. And that's applied to the covenant effected through the work of Jesus. So is Jesus renewing the covenant as Jeremiah was promising, or is Jesus doing something different? So once again, we shall go into groups and have a think about these questions, okay?
Thanks for that one, Susan. I wish you'd had a bit more time to elaborate.
What was the point? Do you want
I
to
was saying that the new covenant is much more inclusive. The old covenant was for the Jews and the law, whereas the new covenant, Jesus is welcoming everybody, anyone who believes in him.
Right.
Yes.
Other thoughts from your discussions?
That sort of ties in with what Sue said, with what we were talking about. You know, with the exile, the temple was decimated, and so they really lost their central worship, I guess, because all their sacrifices and everything were all tied up with the actual temple.
Yeah.
And then they've been shuffled off to Babylon, and they're still being encouraged. It's like, it'll be almost like us as Christians, all our churches are gone. Like, and we, you know,
Yes.
it's like it's part of a central part of what we do.
Yeah.
And yeah.
Yeah. So
The early church
587 is
the early church didn't have churches. It worshipped in people's homes.
yes.
And
That's
we
right.
can go on worshipping in people's homes, even if our churches are all destroyed.
That's right. But as I said, back in that culture, the temple was so central to everything.
Yeah.
And then, you know, it was decimated.
Yeah, which helps us to understand the intense focus that we find in Ezra and Nehemiah about rebuilding the temple and reconsecrating it and reinstituting that. And
Yeah.
then, so 587 was a major traumatic event for the Jewish people. Then, having rebuilt the temple and reconsolidated it, have it destroyed again in 70 under the Romans was a you know, a doubling of, or a quadrupling or something or other of that trauma. So Jeremiah is kind of pivotal in helping begin this shift that leads to a wider view, and a view that God isn't just linked to that land. And the new covenant, or the renewed covenant, is a way of helping the Jewish people see that. Let me suggest that we press on, because we're also covering today the book of Lamentations. Now, we saw last week the last few chapters of Jeremiah that we're just sort of jumping over, tell the end of the story of things from Jeremiah's time, as you can see. And it really concludes with more prophecies of judgment against the foreign nations, and a historical appendix telling of the capture of Jerusalem. So the final notes in Jeremiah are subdued, somber, sad, and that leads immediately to the book of Lamentations in our canonical order. Lamentations never specifically says that it's Jeremiah speaking this. But it's traditionally linked with Jeremiah because, as we saw last week, Jeremiah expresses the anguish that God has for the people. My joy is gone, my grief is upon me, my heart is sick, dismay has taken hold of me. Oh, that my head were a spring of waters, that my eyes are a fountain of tears, that I might weep day and night for the slain of my poor people. So there's some of his oracles are recognizing that God is deeply saddened by what is happening in this political maneuvering that's happening as the new power on the block, the Babylonians, takes control of Jerusalem and takes the people away and destroys the temple. So there's a number of weeping oracles, as we noted last week, in Jeremiah. And that, of course, is the tone of the 5 chapters in the book of Lamentations. Lamentations are poems that express a forlorn hope that the punishment that is now being experienced by Jerusalem, the Judeans sent into exile, will eventually come to an end. But the whole thing is lamenting. Here's the Bible Project's.
The Book of Lamentations. It's a unique book in the Old Testament that contains 5 poems from an anonymous author who survived and is now reflecting back on the Babylonian siege of Jerusalem and the destruction and the exile that followed. Remember the whole story from the book of 2 Kings. The fall of Jerusalem and the exile was the most horrendous catastrophe in Israel's history up to this point. So remember, God had promised Abraham the land. He'd given David victory to make Jerusalem Israel's capital. And from David came the royal line of kings. You had God's presence there in the temple, and that's where the priests maintained the rituals of Israel's worship. And after 500 years of all of this history, in the summer of 587 BC, the city fell to Babylon. It was all decimated and gone. And so the Book of Lamentations is a memorial to the pain and confusion of the Israelites that followed this destruction. Now, the lament poems found here are not unique in the Bible. There's lots of them in the book of Psalms. And these biblical poems of lament, they do a number of things. They're a form of protest. They're a way of drawing everybody's attention, including God's attention, to the horrible things that happen in this world that should not be tolerated. They're a way of processing emotion. So in these poems, God's people vent their anger and dismay at the ruin caused by people's sin and selfishness. And these poems are a place to voice confusion. Suffering makes us ask questions about God's character and promises, and none of this is looked down on in the Bible. Just the opposite. These poems of lament give a sacred dignity to human suffering. And so these human words of grief that are addressed to God have now become part of God's word to his people. The design of these 5 poems is very intentional. It's part of the book's message. So chapters 1 through 4 are called acrostics, which means alphabet poems. Each poetic verse begins with a new letter of the Hebrew alphabet, which is made up of 22 letters. Now, this very ordered and linear structure, it's in stark contrast to the disorder of the pain and the confused grief that's explored in these poems. So it's like Israel's suffering is explored A to Z and is trying to express something that is inexpressible. Chapters 1 and 2 each have 1 verse per letter, giving them a really similar design, but the themes are very different. So chapter 1 focuses on the grief and shame of a figure called Lady Zion. The poet personifies the city of Jerusalem as a widow, also called the daughter of Zion. And she sits alone. She's bereaved of her loved ones, devastated. No one comes to comfort her. It's a very powerful metaphor. And then Lady Zion speaks. She calls on the Lord to notice her fate. And through this image, the poet, he's showing that the city's destruction brought a level of psychological trauma on the Israelites that can only be expressed as the experience of a funeral and the death of a loved one. Chapter 2 focuses on the fall of Jerusalem and how it was a consequence of Israel's sin and was brought about by God's wrath, which is a key word in this poem. Now, it's important to remember that in the Bible, God's wrath is not spontaneous, volatile anger. The biblical poets and prophets, they use this word to talk about God's justice. So Israel had entered a covenant agreement with God, and for centuries they've been violating it by worshiping other gods, perpetrating injustice, oppressing the poor. And so, yes, God is slow to anger, but he eventually does get angry at human evil, and he will bring his just anger in the form of punishment. In the case of Jerusalem, this involved allowing Babylon to come and conquer the city. And so this poem is acknowledging that God's wrath is justified, but this doesn't keep the poet from lamenting and asking God to show compassion once again. Chapter 3 breaks this design pattern by having 3 verses per letter, so it's the longest poem in the book. And the voice is that of a lonely man speaking out of his suffering and grief as a representative of the whole people. And what's interesting is that this chapter is full of language that's drawn from other parts of the Old Testament, from the laments of Job and from other important lament psalms, and even from the suffering servant poems in Isaiah. And the poet sees his hardship as a form of God's justice, like chapter 2 said. But paradoxically, this is what gives the poet hope. And it leads him to offer the only hopeful words in the whole book. Because of the Lord's covenant faithfulness, we do not perish. His mercies never fail. They're new every morning. How great is your faithfulness, O God. So I say to myself, the Lord is my inheritance, therefore I will put my hope in him. So the poet reasons, if God is consistent enough to bring his justice on human evil, then he'll also be consistent with his covenant promise to not allow evil to get the final word. And so for this poet, God's judgment is the seedbed of hope for the future. Chapter 4 goes back to the same alphabet structure as chapters 1 and 2, and is a vivid and disturbing depiction of the 2-year siege in Jerusalem. And it contrasts how things used to be in Jerusalem of the past and how terrible they became in the siege. So children used to laugh and play in the streets, but now they beg for food. The wealthy used to eat lavish meals, but now they eat whatever they can find in the dirt. And the royal leaders used to be full of splendor, but now they're famished and dirty and unrecognizable. And the anointed king from the line of David has been captured and dragged away. So the poem's power comes from the shock of these contrasts, and it's exploring the depth of the suffering that Israel brought on itself. Now, the final poem is unique because it breaks the design pattern. It's the same length as all of the other alphabet poems, but the alphabet order is gone. It's like the poet can't hold it together anymore, and his grief has exploded back into chaos. The poem is a communal prayer for God's mercy. Israel begs God not to ignore their suffering or abandon them. And the poem offers a long list of all of the different kinds of people who were devastated by the fall of the city. They ask God not to forget these people, and they lament on behalf of others, giving voice to their pain. Suffering in silence is just not a virtue in this book. God's people are not asked to deny their emotions, but voice their protest, to vent their feelings and pour it all out before God. The book ends with something of a paradox. The poet acknowledges that God is the eternal king of the world, but also that Israel's circumstances make them feel like God is nowhere to be found. And so the final words of the book leave this tension totally unresolved. It asks, unless you've totally rejected us, and the book ends. The poet doesn't offer a nice, neat conclusion, much like our own experiences of pain and suffering. The story of the Bible doesn't end here, but this very important book shows us how lament and prayer and grief are a crucial part of the journey of faith of God's people in a broken world. And that's what the book of Lamentations is all about.
So we saw in the video the acrostic arrangement in chapters 1, 2, and 4, 22 verses, one for each letter of the alphabet. Here's the Hebrew text, and you can see Hebrew, of course, goes right to left, and you can see the Aleph, Beit, Gimel, Dalet, Hey arrangement, and it goes right through the 22 verses. So that's an easy way to memorize the poems. Interestingly, chapter 3 complicates it because it has 3 Aleph verses and then 3 Beit verses and 3 Gimel verses, and then returns to the 1 verse per letter in chapter 4, and then chapter 5 at least, has 22 verses, but not alphabetically organized. Why? Who knows? So that's the poetry. There's 2 theological elements that I thought would be worth pursuing. First of all, I've never actually done a detailed study of Lamentations before until in preparation for this session, and going through, it's just kind of overwhelming the description of the traumatized state of the people that is provided. And there's 2 paragraphs there in your notes talking about how the people suffer affliction and captivity, grief, suffering, hunger, thirst, etc., etc. So it's really graphic in describing the consequences of what is understood to be God's punishment through God's wrath of the people for their sinfulness by sending them into exile. And yet, there's a wonderful verse or section, about 11 verses in the middle of chapter 3, the steadfast love or the covenant faithfulness of the Lord never ceases. His mercies never come to an end. They are new every morning. Great is your faithfulness. I've got an earworm for that because there's a scripture in song setting of that verse. So it's interesting that beautiful expression of God's love is here in the midst of all of this lamenting about the situation of the people. And we have seen in many of the prophets that they talk both about God's wrath and rightful punishment of the people, and also of God's love and concern and compassion for them. So I wonder what you think. Does Lamentations, by piling out, by speaking out in this great pile up of emotion, does Lamentations offer us a way to reconcile these 2 aspects in the character of God? So let me invite you to ponder that once again in your rooms, please. Okay, welcome back. So who's got the resolution of God's wrath and God's love from Lamentations?
Well, I think it's a cleansing process that was occurring, so that he got rid of the Jewish people got rid of the large number of other gods and became a solely a people of Yahweh.
Interestingly, by going to another country, immersed in the country of where all those other gods were. Yes, it's kind of paradoxical, isn't it?
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah.
I pulled out verse 24, the Lord is my portion, says my soul, and, you know, God on a plate. And we talked in the group of how all too often you can focus just on the pain in personal lives, and to reach the point where you can perceive there is more than just pain, but you can't deny the pain because that's not truth. And you can't say there is only pain, because this for most people is also not the truth. But to try and find that balance with God on your side.
So there needs to be a realism about the situation, and certainly the lamenting in Lamentations expresses very graphically the realism of the situation, doesn't it? Yeah.
We did sort of say that the 2 in a way, or I'm not sure, but the 2 in a way marry together, because it didn't matter. And even Henry said those poor people who did actually do the right thing. We can't imagine that every single Israelite or every single person in Judah was being so sinful that God got extremely wrathful. There must have been some people that were really good, and we thought, oh, those poor people.
Yes.
You know, a bit like the siblings that all get punished, even though only one of them did the wrong thing.
Yeah.
But you know, it doesn't matter how angry they made God, and wrath is such a big word. There was still always that hope, because there was always that redeeming forgiveness at the end. So there was God's love in actions bringing them back and things like that. So they do, it's almost like a parent who disciplines, although wrath is a lot worse than discipline, but disciplines out of love, because they want to teach their children the right thing.
They want the best for their child.
Yes, that's a good way to put it. Yes. So they do need to discipline when the child does something wrong, because they want that child to be a better person and know right from wrong.
So there is a loving
And
intention
that's right.
in
Yes.
executing discipline, but is
Yes.
there a loving intention in allowing wrath to bubble over into such destructive
Oh,
ways?
I don't know. Such a big word, isn't it?
Yes, that's right.
They really, really made him cranky.
Yeah, so it's the building from I'm annoyed to I'm angry,
Yeah.
to I'm furious, to wrath
That's-
seems to top all of that, doesn't it? Still.
Yeah. It's like you've just gone that one little bit too far. I've had enough.
I might be a minority view of one here, but I just wonder whether you can reconcile those two aspects, and maybe we just have to live with both. And it's very awkward and very difficult, and somehow we just need to try to grapple with both. But maybe you can't reconcile them ultimately. But I don't know.
Yeah, and none of the prophets are systematicians in the sense of, you know, how the medieval scholars got hold of all of Scripture and started to build a systematic theology of how things all fitted together. The prophets aren't doing that. The prophets are reflecting on the immediacy of the situation and expressing the emotions that are there, both negative and positive, if you like. And so I think you're onto something, Matt, in terms of what the biblical text offers us. It simply offers us these things side by side and doesn't attempt to explain
No, I think it's up to
rationally,
us.
logically, systematically.
I think
how
it's
it
up
all
to, sorry, John.
Yeah, go on.
I think it's up to us as individuals to make our own decisions about the rights and wrongs, or the wrath and the love, or the whatever.
Yeah.
That's where it is. I think it's been left to us to decide that for ourselves, not for everybody, but for ourselves personally.
So that's an interesting observation then, and I connect that with the claim that we make in the church again and again after we hear Scripture, in this is the word of the Lord, or through the Bible we hear God speaking to us.
Yes.
And there's a way of understanding that is God is speaking to us, God is telling us, God has decided this is it. We just have to understand. But there's another way of understanding in this is the word of the Lord, in that we're in a conversation with God and this is what God says, and we then need to think about it and respond to it. And it's not all tied down. It's not all sewn up. It's not all sorted through. So our part, our word back to the word of the Lord may well invite us to hear then another word of the Lord from somewhere else in Scripture. So it becomes a conversation rather than just a hearing and that's what I must do.
I think, John, we've sort of sanitized our language, haven't we, to make it make us all feel better about our conversations with God. And I was reading an essay from Bergman on lament, and he was saying how, like, we treat prayers as cathartic to make us feel better, whereas in these lamenting type places, there's a more confronting, I suppose, conversation between God and us. We're more honest and raw with our emotions and what we're thinking about. So we've sort of cleansed all that out. So we just have these very nice, polite conversations with God, and please God, do this, and so on. So
yeah,
perhaps we need to get back to that. I don't know how it would go down in church if we started venting to God,
yeah.
but maybe private lives.
So lament is sometimes used, like I think back years ago when there was a shooting in a shopping centre at Strathfield. I knew some of the people that were involved in making creating like an interfaith service to deal with that. You know, you think about Port Arthur and how people grapple with that. Lament has a place in public life in situations like that, where there's something very traumatic that has happened that in fact impacts a whole lot of people. And we can kind of do it in that situation. But yes, we find it hard to do in the regular flow of things in the church, I guess. Yeah. In the life of the Jewish people over the millennia, there have been many traumatic experiences. The first traumatic experience for the northerners was being taken over by the Assyrians. And then for the southerners, it was the destruction of Jerusalem and the temple and being taken into exile in Babylon. And then, of course, there was the trauma of the Second Temple, 6 centuries later, that was destroyed under the Romans. And of course, in our own era, if you like, there has been the trauma of the Shoah, the Holocaust, in the which led to was part of a sequence of events leading to the Second World War, and you know, in Jewish history, there have been a whole lot of other pogroms and massacres and so on. The Book of Lamentations occupies a special place in Jewish liturgy because on a day called Tish B'Av, which is usually around late July or early August, so it's just past, the destruction of the first temple by the Babylonians and the destruction of the second temple by the Romans is commemorated. And in Jewish thought, they both happened on the same calendar day. Fortuitously or providentially, however you want to see it. So they have this annual remembrance of that. They also have annual remembrances of the Shoah, of course, and of Kristallnacht and other more recent ones. But Lamentations is recited in full on Tish B'Av, which must be an intense emotional worship experience. So we know that during the Shoah, during the Holocaust, for Jewish people, this was a great upheaval. How do you hold to your faith in the light of this terrible experience that was happening? And Elie Wiesel, of course, is the most widely known voice, but there's a lot of grappling with this. And Lamentations might speak into that kind of situation. So I wonder, I've included this quote from Whitney Willard. The Bible Project has not only videos, but it also has blogs. And this is this guy, I don't know who he is, Whitney Willard, but he's written, I thought, this really helpful paragraph about lament. Lament allows us to fully face and name our pain. It creates space for future resolution. It doesn't actually do anything for the present, but it helps us move through to what might happen in the future. It gives hope without glossing over the trauma. It gives us permission to protest life's difficulties, to scream, cry, vent, plead, complain in the presence of God and others. It lets us ask the hard questions without condemnation. It might be messy and uncomfortable, but it's the first step towards healing. And, you know, we might like to reflect on this in terms of intergenerational trauma amongst First Nations people, and the whole way of dealing with, you know, Archie Rose just died, but dealing with the stolen generation, which has come into public prominence in our own lifetimes, and a way of responding to that and dealing with that, saying sorry, but that involves a lamenting process. So we might like to think of it in terms of that process. The very last verse of Lamentations leaves us with a question. It's not God through the prophet or through the poet saying to us, okay, this is how it'll all get worked out. It's raising the question, what if God is going to be perpetually? So there's a couple of questions bunched up, perhaps unfairly, in this discussion. Does lamentation, oh, sorry, no, we've done that. Oh, that's the quote, which I should have put up before as I was reading it. Lamenting is messy and uncomfortable, but the first step towards healing. So can you see a role for lament in helping us or helping other people face the consequences of trauma and rebuild hope for the future? And is this last verse, unless you have utterly rejected us, unless you are angry with us beyond measure, it should have sort of ends with a ... unresolved. Is this last verse of Lamentations actually the last word about dealing with God's anger? How did you go with your questions?
John, could I just share something I shared with my group? I've been reading a little about the Holocaust to Shoah, and if I'd been Jewish and had lived through it and survived it and seen most of my family exterminated in the gas chambers and the ovens, I wouldn't have been lamenting. I would have given up my faith and walked away from it. And I would have said, if God is not dead himself, God has abandoned us. God has broken the covenant with us. So I'm under no more obligation to God. I'm going to go off and become an atheist. And that's I'm sure that's how I might have responded.
Yeah.
Yes, it would have been the case of, well, there is no God if this is happening.
And didn't Eli Wiesel say when they hung the wee lad, you know, the Jewish men were standing there and they were all men, where is God? And someone pointed to the boy that was being hung, said, there is God.
Yeah, so that's the other way of responding, which has become a pretty significant form of doing theology, that God is there in the suffering rather than God causing the suffering or even God allowing the suffering, but God is actually suffering. Ian, certainly there are Jews that did take the path that you said. In the late 1980s, I was minister of the Uniting Church in the eastern suburbs of Sydney, and I inherited from my predecessor a weekly discussion group, and we kind of morphed it because there were so many Jews that came on Friday to our school for seniors and took part in all of the activities that were happening. I established along with the local rabbi, established a Jewish Christian discussion group, and it was meeting in one of the small meeting rooms with sort of a dozen people, but it grew, and we decided then that we would move it into the church. And the church in the marketplace where I was had a huge, big rough wooden cross at the front. And one of the Jewish guys said to me, I really enjoy coming to this group, but you know, I don't think I can come to it now if you're going to meet there, because I never go into a church because of what happened to my family in the Holocaust. And the cross was associated with Hitler's regime and with what happened, you know. So we had a really interesting discussion, and in the end he did come and sit up the back in the building, but he had just given up on all hope. He was a kind of cultural Jew, you know. He maintained Jewish understanding, but he didn't believe in a God. And that for me was a difficult kind of moment, but a striking kind of moment about the depth of impact that these traumatic events can have. So you cannot blame somebody who lost so many members of their family from saying, God, you abandoned me, in a sense, really, can you? Okay, well, as I said, people, every year Jews hear the whole book of Lamentations, and if you haven't read it, maybe you would like to read through it after today's study, as they remember the destruction of both temples. It also provides us with a kind of avenue to channel grief and loss. All right, next week we are going to enter into the weird and wonderful world of another priest who was called to be a prophet. Jeremiah was a priest called to be a prophet. Ezekiel was a priest called to be a prophet. And so I invite you to read the opening chapters of Ezekiel, and then chapter 11, chapter 37, which is the most well-known section of Ezekiel. We'll talk about that vision in the Valley of Dry Bones. And then chapter 47, which is perhaps a section of Ezekiel that should be better known than it actually is. You'll see why when you read it. You can read the whole 48 chapters if you want to, but that's where our focus is going to be next week when we move on to the prophet Ezekiel.